everyone, welcome to another episode of ELS Discourse. I'm Prakhar Raghuvanshi, founding editor at ELSR. Today we have with us Professor Aakash Singh Rathore. Professor Rathore has taught at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Universities of Delhi, Pennsylvania, Toronto, Berlin, and Rome. He has authored over 8 books, including Ambedkar's Preamble, A Secret History to the Constitution of India, which we shall refer again and again during the course of this discussion. He has edited a number of books and is also currently the series editor of Rethinking India series being published by Penguin in association with Samruddh Bharat Foundation. He is a regular contributor to Indian Express, Outlook, Huffington Post, etc. Lastly, and very interestingly also, Professor Rathore is also India's #3 Ironman triathlete. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir. It's an honor to have a conversation with you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So, starting with the very first question, sir, how relevant is Preamble today in our lives? It has importance in courts. We read it in judgments, where Supreme Court judges refer to it time and again. But how important a preamble to the Constitution is for an ordinary citizen? This question becomes important as we saw people across the nation reading out preamble during the citizenship amendment protests. So what do you think, how important and how significant is preamble today?
Well, I think you know that my answer will be that it's very significant since I spent so much time writing a book about it. But let's say not from the point of view, I'm a legal scholar. So obviously, as you pointed out in your question, for the entire legal establishment, it's a crucial document. What about for the ordinary citizen? So looking from their point of view, let's think about the protests that you mentioned. What was happening with the reading of the preamble, and as I'm sure you noticed in multiple languages beyond the English version, what was happening is that citizens were in some way reclaiming symbols or one can almost say totems of the national movement. Now, I find it very curious that I have 2 daughters in 6th and 9th standards, and each of their textbooks, the NCRT textbook, have the preamble in the opening pages, and these are not pages that they ever look at. In fact, I don't think that they had ever once read the preamble, despite that every subject, whether it's political science or SST or it's geography, it's in every single textbook. So that's why I refer to it as a totem. It's been elevated to a kind of sacred symbol that it has to be put into every textbook. And yet it doesn't prove effective in that way because kids just pass it. What does it have to do with geography? What does it have to do with the other subjects that this preamble is put into the preliminary pages of? So from the citizen's point of view, we know this has been elevated by government to some kind of a sacred symbol. Now, to whom does that sacred symbol belong? Normally, sacred symbols are the prerogative of a priest or of a person in authority. And in this case, it was the government that decided that each child in India needs to have the preamble nailed into their heads in every textbook and so on. So what we find basically is that there have been attempts for the government to dictate the terms of what this document means and its significance. What we saw in the protests were that the citizens were reappropriating autonomously the meaning, the significance of this document. So the citizens were not satisfied with the sanctimonious way that the government has represented this text. And more importantly, if we go a layer deeper, these protesters, due to the polarized rhetoric that we find ourselves in India and across the world today, people are divided into nationalists and anti-nationalists. And there doesn't seem to be a space for ideologies, gradations, or a spectrum. And the people who protest, given that government is always, representing people who are against it as enemies of the state, not enemies of that particular administration, were branded as anti-national. And so what the preamble represented for citizens at the moment of protest was a reappropriation of national symbols to show that the branding of them by the government as anti-national is an incoherent argument. They were flipping the terms of the engagement so that they, as protesters, are showing that they're actually living up to the spirit and values of our Constitution and the foundation of the Republic, which by implication suggests that there is something deeply wrong with the government and administration if it is the citizens who are representing the ideals and the principles of the Republic. Then what is it that the government is doing? So the preamble has these several layers of significance in your average citizen's life. On the one hand, it is crammed down or rammed down our throats, but in a way that is obviously ineffective. On the other hand, it is something that we ourselves might pick up, might appropriate as a demonstration of our civic duties, like civil disobedience if it's called for, and to show that when we disobey a current government or a current administration, it doesn't mean we're anti-national. It might in fact mean that we are speaking the ideals of the nation. So it's a very significant document because it in a way liberates the citizen. The citizen, average citizen, has something to hold on to say, you cannot exclude me, you cannot condemn me, you cannot in blanket refer to me as an anti-national or a urban Naxal or some category that dismisses me. I represent the very values that this nation was founded upon. And here is my character certificate. It is the preamble that shows that what I am doing now is what must or should be done. So in this respect, I think even way beyond legal scholars and so on, the preamble does have a significant role to play in an ordinary citizen's day-to-day existence.
So, sir, what do you mean is that it's the preamble has evolved from a mere symbolism to, and now it has come to life.
Yes, and there have been many false attempts to bring the preamble to life from the part of government administration. These are very paternalistic attempts. As you know, I've written a book on the preamble. I've spent years studying it. And even when someone like me opens the SST book of my 6th standard child and sees the preamble, I get a lot annoyed. I think, what on earth is this? Why is this here? This is not the way that this should be done. So there's this attempt to superficially, paternalistically bring it to us like it's our gift. It's not a gift by the current administration or the previous administration to us. It is the very foundation of the Republic. It represents us. It doesn't have to be handed to us paternalistically. And the recent protests have really brought material and substance to this realization. This is our document. This is not something that you have to ram down my throat. This is mine. This is mine, and let me tell you what it means. So it's become very, very powerful in the hands of the people, even more powerful than it has been in the hands of the judiciary or the government.
Okay. So moving ahead, in the very first chapter of your book, which is talks about the idea of justice. So you have portrayed a Gandhian versus Ambedkarite notion of justice debate there. So what are the key differences between both the notions of justice, and why Ambedkarite notion do you feel is better suited to this country?
There are, this is a very complicated question. I'm sure you realize that. And to do the question justice would require re-examining Gandhi's ideas in a charitable way. So when someone has to answer a question quickly, they tend not to be charitable, but just to move to the conclusion as quickly as possible. So just keep in mind that there will be somewhat of a caricature of Gandhi's ideas when having to answer a question like this. Within that warning, the main issue at hand is that I just spoken about paternalism. Gandhi's way of communicating to the masses was often very paternalistic. You can see this sense of paternalism in the very term that was argued and debated between Gandhi and Gandhians and Ambedkar and Ambedkarites about calling the scheduled caste or the untouchables Harijans versus Dalits or some other nomenclature. Now, when what were referred to in that time as the depressed classes, when the depressed classes pushed back somewhat against Gandhi's epithet, Harijan, Gandhians, including within the Bombay Legislative Assembly, said, no, this is the term that Gandhi has decided to use, and this is what you are, for better or for worse. It's not our problem. So Ambedkar had raised within the Bombay Legislative Assembly that this word Harijan should not be enacted into law. It was not proper, and it was a term that was paternalistically applied to people. In fact, Ambedkar said, if we untouchables are the children of God, then who are everyone else the children of? So I use that term as an example of the sort of paternalistic procedure that one often finds in Gandhi's methods. Ambedkar had a very, very different approach. It was clearly bottom-up, grassroots, as we say today. And you find this in his many speeches and articulations that the untouchables are never going to be given justice. The untouchables must fight for justice. They must rise up and demand it. Justice is not something that is just sort of granted as some boon or some gift, even by the state. Justice must always be wrested from the state. Justice must always be wrested from an unjust society. And this puts the agency into the hands of the Dalits or of the people themselves who are concerned with this issue of justice, whether it should be gender justice. It puts the agency into the hands of women and non-normative gender people, whether it be caste justice, as I was just speaking of, or religious justice, and so on. Agency needs to be put in the hand of the persons or group or people who are in pursuit of justice, not into the hands of those who are going to bestow it as a charity. This can be seen once again in the Harijan Sevak Sangh that Gandhi had formed. There was a fairly well-known in the era, activist named Rajboj, and Rajboj had actually signed, he was an untouchable from Maharashtra, not a Mahar caste untouchable. So he wasn't in the community that was generally supporting Dr. Ambedkar, but in a smaller community that had some rivalry with it. So Rajboj was often in league with the Congress, and in fact, he signed the Pune Pact along with, in the column that represented Gandhi's group, rather than the column that represented Ambedkar's group. So Rajboj was decided that he, true to his social work for his community, was going to become very active in the Harijan Sevak Sangh. And Gandhi wrote him a letter. And in the letter, which I have, in fact, it states, don't you understand that Harijan Sevak Sangh is not for Harijans. It is for the upper caste to wash away the sins of their practice of untouchability, practicing untouchability. So we, the upper caste, are going to do seva to you, the Harijans. So you have no role in this organization. And Rajboj took that letter. He went over to Ambedkar's house and he showed it to him, and he apologized to Ambedkar. And he said, you've been right all along. We've been used as stooges and tools, and the idea has never been to empower us from below as agents to shape our own destiny. The idea has always been that the majority community will give us charity if we beg for it. And in many respects, once again, I'm caricaturing Gandhi through these examples, but in many respects, this represents the mainstream of the difference. Gandhi's is agent-based, ground up. I'm sorry, Ambedkar's is agent-based, ground up. And it shows that the idea of justice is not a gift and it's not a charity. It's a principle that must be pursued, vigorously pursued by the agents who need it. Whereas in Gandhi's terms, there was a more harmonious cosmological sense that if everyone just does their job, does their duty, justice will descend upon all of us. And Ambedkar was radically opposed to the utopian sense of this and didn't believe, as Gandhi kept arguing from the as early as 1920s, that untouchability will disappear on its own if the Harijans just stopped agitating. For Dr. Ambedkar, of course, one must never stop agitating, because justice doesn't just arrive once and for all. It has to keep being pursued.
Moving to the next question. In the 4th chapter of the book, Ambedkar's Preamble, where you talk about fraternity clause of the Preamble, you have mentioned that the drafting committee unanimously rejected placing nation before dignity of the individual. So can you explain what's the conceptual understanding behind this and how this can be imported in today's time, where we have started this discussion by going back to the difference of nationals and anti-national, which are being used by the government, or let's say the majoritarian rule right now. So can that idea be imported to the current position?
Yes, I think I don't think it merely can be. I think it's a necessity. It's something that we have to be constantly vigilant about. So I don't want to be pedantic, but just to point out that this clause, this refusal to interchange nation, make nation come prior to individual, it wasn't really unanimously rejected by the drafting committee. It was those three most important people, and considering that most of the other members of the drafting committee didn't show up very often, they were the three who really mattered. But that's just a pedantic footnote. I apologize for that. There's a reason behind it, because it's important what was unanimous and what wasn't unanimous, considering my whole argument in the book, which is that we like to represent the preamble as being the work of a kind of consensus of the committee. But my argument is, if you really look at the minutes, there was no committee. There was Dr. Ambedkar, who was there every time. And then there were people who would show up now and again and say, so what's new? You know, so that's a small point. Now, why did three people as differently ideologically aligned as Munshi, Ambedkar, and B.N. Rao? I mean, you couldn't find three people more different in their ideological orientation. They all quickly came together on this, and they said, we will have none of that. And remember, there were more than 20 recommendations for this coming from the Constituent Assembly. Their argument, as I outline in the book, was in a pithy way captured by this expression: there will not be unity in the nation unless and until there is dignity of the individual. And therefore, conceptually, logically, dignity of the individual must come prior to unity of the nation, because we will not have unity in the nation unless and until we have dignity of the individual. Now that, which was written by B.N. Rao in response to the to be read in the open assembly, that is something that I don't think we understand fully even today. And so your question is interesting, because I think we need to repeat that to ourselves. We often say, why don't we can transgress certain normal procedures of policing or of practices in encounter and so on, for ensuring the security, integrity of the nation. But Ambedkar, Munshi, and Rao's argument was the opposite, that unless and until we maintain these procedures that were set up in recognition, in full recognition of the fundamental and inviolable dignity of every Indian citizen, unless and until we maintain constant vigil about this, we will never have unity in our nation. So the standard sort of balancing security versus the individual dignity, this balance, which we play with today, and since more or less the 21st century, the September 11 disaster in New York, and then subsequently the attack Parliament in Delhi, and then the slow creation over the years in the first decade of the 21st century of major legislation allowing for violations of individual, of privacy, of certain, suspension of habeas corpus and other other principles that we never would have dreamed of violating other than during an emergency. All of these things began to flood in. And what is the justification for these things? National security. So this idea of the integrity of the nation having to take a priority, and therefore fundamental basic rights of Indian citizens having to take a back seat. This is the very thing that Munshi, Ambedkar, and Rao were worried about. If you will put forward national integrity at the expense of individual dignity, then what we have is creeping fascism and authoritarianism, and not a modern liberal constitutional democracy. So that Ambedkar, Rao, and Munshi, all collectively of different ideologies, fought to maintain the fundamental priority of dignity of the individual, and then the secondary priority of unity of the nation, because of the logical connection. We will not have national unity unless we have universal human dignity. That they foresaw what the problem we might find ourselves in today. Just imagine if our preamble had a priority of nation over individual dignity. Every inequity we see today, every crushing of protest, of dissent, every declaration that this academician had questioned the sovereignty of India, and therefore he's an immediate threat and has to go to jail. I mean, we've jailed so many intellectuals in recent times. Anand Teltumbde, a great hero of mine, I disagree with him on many of his writings, but that makes no difference whatsoever. The very fact that an intellectual as brilliant and accomplished as he is merely says some words, or is present at a meeting where words are said, and now he's in jail. This shows us what it means to claim that unity or integrity of the nation is more important than the rights and dignities of the individual. So it's the most important priority that the preamble teaches us, I think.
since the discussion is continuing on dignity, there's a chapter in the book, I guess this fifth chapter of the book, which talks about dignity. The last page of the book, last page of the chapter has an image of Dr. Ambedkar. And the book, that particular chapter reveals that the clause with respect to dignity in the preamble was absent from all the major documents which were referred, like the objective resolution or what B.N. Rao's note had to say. And you have credited Dr. Ambedkar for inclusion of this clause, and you have also argued that the idea stems from Dr. Ambedkar's personal experiences. There's a bit of discussion on that. And what is this idea, Dr. Ambedkar's idea of dignity, and are these personal experiences specific to caste discrimination, or there are any other instances as well?
Yeah. So yes, you've correctly represented what I argue in the book on this issue. What we should understand is that the term dignity spent most of its history meaning something very different from what we mean by it in the 20th century and now in the 21st century. So its longer history, going back to Latin, is about hierarchy and rank. And this changed as a consequence, more or less, of Kantian, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, Kantian philosophy. Now, I'm a philosopher myself, and we often like to say that philosophers changed the world. So just bear with me if you find that humorous. But Kant had begun to use this term, dignity. The German word is Menschenwert, and so human worth or human value. He had begun to use this word in the sense that it is infinite. So everything that we know of in the world has a price. You can buy this cup of coffee that I'm drinking. You can buy my book for only 495 rupees. But you cannot, must not buy a human person. Consequently, this became one of the foundations. Kant's moral philosophy became one of the foundations against a liberal tradition that was quite comfortable with slavery, buying and selling people. But when Kant's moral philosophy came onto the scene, there was an absolute prohibition against slavery, because it's based on treating a human person as though they have a price, and the human person is priceless. And that word, Menschenwert, or the pricelessness of human value, became translated into English as dignity. And in this translation as dignity, the meaning, the long previous history of meaning as a kind of hierarchy, of dignity as a kind of hierarchy, got substituted by this new Kantian meaning of dignity. Now, where we saw the Kantian idea of dignity reemerge first was in the new constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany after the Second World War. So this is all unfolding in the 1940s at the same time in Germany, and in India, and of course many other places. And what happens is that the Holocaust, the Nazi genocide against the Jewish and Roma and homosexual people, this was the highest possible expression of the failure to recognize the absolute worth of the human person. And so when the Germans were framing their new constitution, they wanted to make the strongest possible statement that nothing like this would ever be possible again in the German territories. So they made it Article 1 of their constitution. And I'm just working from memory here, but I believe Article 1 of the German constitution runs like this: human dignity is inviolable. So a blanket statement like that, very powerful. And then the next article, the next clause is, it is the duty of the state to respect and protect the dignity of the individual. Now, this is interesting because it's one thing to declare that dignity is inviolable, and it's another thing altogether to demand that the state protects and preserves that dignity. Now, why so much pressure? Precisely because of what Germany had done. And this changed the nature of how we understand dignity. This is the 1940s Europe, and Dr. Ambedkar was very well aware of all of these developments. And so when I talk about dignity as being written into the preamble by Dr. Ambedkar on the basis of his experiences, it is because of the analogous experience that Dr. Ambedkar had with the European Jewry. In other words, that just like the Jews, the untouchables had experienced a kind of long-standing and flagrant failure to recognize their dignity, their individual worth as a human person. So clearly there are analogies, there are other kinds of ways that people experience this lack of dignity that would make them be champions of dignity. And I went through the explanation of the genealogy of the term to show you that this is not something this is not a term Dr. Ambedkar invented. It's a term that he appropriated as being perfectly fitting for the situation within which he found the trajectory of his own life and of the people that he wanted to ensure finally received recognition of their dignity through the new constitution. Maybe I'll leave it at that for in answer to that question. Some aspects might arise later.
So essentially, sir, you are saying that the Kantian idea of the two categorical imperatives, treating persons as ends in themselves, is the idea which Ambedkar had, and that is the idea which the preamble talks about.
Yes, it's not merely that. If you look at what Dr. Ambedkar had written in States and Minorities, you see that was his first draft constitution. You see that one of the fundamental principles is that to treat a human as an end in itself and never as a means. And as you rightly state, this is one of the formulations of the categorical imperative or Kant's moral philosophy, which is referred to as deontological, which is to say that there are no conditions. You don't treat a person with dignity unless he broke the law, right? You treat a person with dignity even if he broke the law. You treat a person with dignity. That's what natural justice is, right? You maintain these procedures irrespective of however flagrant the criminal act might have been. So Ambedkar had many times in his previous writing touched upon overlapping ideas of the formulations of Kant's categorical imperative. And so when he speaks of dignity, it definitely echoes Kant's idea of Menschenwort, which we see in the first article of the German Constitution. And when he writes it into the preamble, there is definitely that echo that the Indian state has the duty and obligation to recognize and protect the dignity of the individual. And of course, the way that Dr. Ambedkar originally wrote it on February 6, 1948, the dignity of the individual irrespective of caste.
So with this, we conclude the first part of this interview. So far, we have discussed significance of the preamble, Gandhian and Ambedkarite notions of justice, fraternity and dignity clause of the preamble. You can watch the second part of this interview by clicking on the link in the description below.